The rain fell in a steady gray sheet over the sprawling complex of the Tuileries Palace, but inside the royal apartments, the atmosphere was far more oppressive than any weather could muster. King Louis XVI sat hunched over a locksmith's table in a private study, the soft clinking of his metalworking tools the only sound he found comforting anymore. For him, the world had shrunk to the intricate workings of a new lock he was designing. Outside that small haven, France was collapsing. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, stood by the window of her gilded drawing room, her gaze fixed on the unruly crowds that milled about the palace courtyards. They were everywhere, National Guardsmen with their cockades, fishwives with their sharp tongues, and radical agitators from the city's tumultuous sections. She watched a group of men shake their fists at the Swiss Guard sentries standing stoically at the main gate. A shiver, cold as the grave, ran down her spine. Every whisper in the corridors, on every shadow that fell across the palace walls, spoke of betrayal. It was into this world of simmering paranoia that their son, Louis Charles, the little prince, navigated his childhood. He was only 7 years old, a boy with his father's placid expression, but his mother's lively eyes. His world was a strange paradox, immense luxury confined by invisible walls of fear. His playmates were not the children of nobles, but his devoted sister, Marie-Thérèse, and his favorite toy, a miniature working guillotine, a darkly ironic gift from an aunt that now seemed prophetic. As evening fell, a family dinner was served in the private dining room. The king, finally emerging from his workshop, ate with his characteristic heavy appetite, seemingly oblivious to the tension. The queen, however, merely pushed her food around her plate. The prince, bored with the silent meal, began to fidget. "Mama, why are the men outside so angry?" he asked, and his young voice cutting through the quiet. Marie Antoinette's face tightened. "They are not angry with you, my cherubin," she said softly, her Austrian accent still faintly detectable. "But they shout at the guards," the boy insisted. "Papa, why do they shout at the soldiers who protect us?" Louis XVI looked up, a piece of bread in his hand. He chewed slowly, considering the question. "Because, my son, they listen to bad men who tell them lies. They think we are their enemies, when we are only trying to be their father and mother." It was a simplistic answer for a complex horror, but it was all he had. Later that night, the prince's governess, the Marquise de Tourzel, tucked him into his canopied bed. He looked up at her, his face serious. "Marquise, if the bad men get in, will you hide me? Will you hide Maman and Papa?" The Marquise assured him she would, her own heart pounding at the very thought. As she left the room, she passed a pair of Swiss guards in their red uniforms, their halberds glinting in the candlelight. They were the last line of defense, the silent, loyal giants who stood between this fragile family and the abyss. The prince stared at the door long after it closed, listening to the distant, unsettling murmur of the city he was too young to understand, but old enough to fear. The weeks that followed the family dinner only tightened the noose around the palace. The political landscape of Paris had become a volatile powder keg, and the fuse was burning fast. Rumors, the lifeblood of the revolution, flew through the streets with the speed of gunfire. It was said that the Prussian army was marching on Paris. It was said that the Queen was sending French war plans to her Austrian relatives. It was said that the king, once freed by foreign bayonets, would unleash a bloody revenge on the city. All of it was a dangerous mixture of truth, exaggeration, and outright lies, but the people of Paris believed it with a fervent passion. Inside the Tuileries, the king's advisors were in a constant state of panic. The Marquis de Lafayette, once the hero of the revolution, now found himself caught in the middle, responsible for the king's safety, but deeply distrusted by the radical Jacobins. He warned the king daily of the mounting danger. The National Assembly was deadlocked, unable to decide the fate of the monarchy. The air was thick with the scent of impending disaster. On the morning of August 9th, 1792, the tension broke. Word arrived that the sections of Paris, the powerful district governments, had declared a state of insurrection. They were mobilizing the people. The tocsin, the dreaded alarm bell, was expected to ring at any moment. The palace braced for impact. King Louis spent the day in desperate meetings, his usual calm replaced by a deep, weary anxiety. He reviewed the defenses, and they had around 900 Swiss guards, some of the finest professional soldiers in Europe, disciplined and utterly loyal. In addition, there were about 200 remaining gentlemen, nobles who had flocked to the palace to defend their king, armed with swords, pistols, and the daggers that would later give the day its infamous name. They were brave, but they were not soldiers. And they were vastly outnumbered by the hundreds of fédérés and National Guardsmen from the poor sections who were now marching on the Tuileries. By nightfall, the palace became a fortress under siege. Fires were lit in the courtyards. The Swiss Guard took up their positions at every window, every door, every staircase. Their commander, a seasoned officer named Karl Joseph von Bachmann, moved among his men, ensuring their powder was dry and their spirits high. They knew the odds. They knew the fury of the mob, but they had sworn an oath. Little Louis Charles was unaware of the strategic discussions. He was aware only of the change in the air. The adults were sharp, their voices hushed and urgent. He was kept close to his mother and aunt, Princess Elizabeth. He watched as his father, looking older than his years, paced the floor. He saw his mother's hands tremble as she held her rosary. He heard the distant rhythmic drumming from the city, a sound that was not music, but a threat. It was the sound of thousands of feet marching toward his home. The world he knew, the world of silk and guards and bedtime stories, was about to end. The wolves were at the gate. The night of August 9th bled into the early morning of August 10th without sleep for the royal family. The distant drums had grown into a constant, menacing roar, punctuated by the clatter of horses on the cobblestones and the sharp cries of patrols. Inside the palace, time seemed to move both terribly fast and impossibly slow. At the break of dawn, King Louis, accompanied by a small escort, decided to review the troops in the Carousel courtyard. He walked among the Swiss guards, their red coats bright in the gray morning light, their formation immaculate. He moved with a heavy gait, stopping to speak a few words to the officers, his expression a mask of sorrow rather than command. He then turned to the volunteers and the National Guardsmen who had sworn to protect him. It was here that the first crack appeared. "Long live the nation!" shouted a voice from the ranks. The cry was not for the king, but against him. The king's face paled, but he continued his inspection. When he returned inside, the mood was even grimmer. The National Guard artillerymen, who were positioned to defend the palace, were openly fraternizing with the growing crowd. They turned the cannons around, pointing them not at the people, but at the palace walls. The king's defenders were melting away before a single shot was fired. Back in the royal apartments, the queen was with her children. Marie-Thérèse, a serious girl of 14, tried to be brave for her brother. Louis Charles, sensing his sister's fear, clung to her hand. Marie-Antoinette, her face etched with a profound and terrible weariness, dressed her son in a simple, plain frock, hoping to disguise him if the worst happened. She then pinned a small green ribbon to his chest, a symbol of hope she barely felt. As the morning wore on, the noise from outside became deafening. The vast courtyard was filling with a sea of humanity, National Guardsmen who had switched sides, fédérés from Marseille and Brittany singing their new war song, and ordinary Parisians armed with pikes, sabers, and axes. They screamed for the king's head. By mid-morning, the decision was made. The king could not hold the palace. and to stay meant certain death for his entire family. He agreed to seek refuge with the National Assembly, the very body that was stripping him of his power. At around 8:30 a.m., Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their 2 children, and the king's sister, Madame Elisabeth, left the Tuileries. They walked through the gardens, past the ornamental ponds, a small, huddled group of fugitives crossing the open ground as the roar of the mob grew behind them. Louis Charles, holding his mother's hand tightly, looked back at the palace. It loomed large and silent, the red-coated Swiss guards still visible at the windows. He didn't know he was seeing his home for the very last time. They entered the manège, the riding school where the assembly met, and were ushered into the tiny, cramped reporter's box behind the president's chair. It was a small, stuffy room, barely 7 feet square. The family of the Bourbons, the descendants of the Sun King, were now prisoners in a broom closet, and listening to the distant sound of gunfire as their loyal soldiers were butchered in their defense. The gunfire the royal family heard from their cramped hiding place was the sound of a massacre. After the king and his family departed, the Swiss guards were left with a confusing and fatal set of orders. The king had instructed them to lay down their arms and withdraw, but the message was garbled, failing to reach all the contingents. Some officers, seeing the mob pouring into the courtyard, ordered their men to hold fire. Others, watching their comrades being shot down by the first wave of insurgents, gave the order to defend themselves. A devastating volley of musketry rang out from the palace windows. The front ranks of the mob, packed into the Cour du Carrousel, were torn apart. Dozens fell, screaming, onto the blood-soaked cobblestones. For a moment, the sheer shock of the professional volley halted the advance, but the pause was brief. The Swiss fire enraged the crowd, and the National Guard artillery, now firmly in rebel hands, opened fire on the palace with the cannons that had once been meant to defend it. The thin walls of the Tuileries were no match for cannonballs. They tore through the masonry, shredding the elegant rooms within. Inside the reporter's box at the manège, the royal family could hear every terrifying boom of the cannons. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, a deep percussive thud that shook the very floor. Marie Antoinette, her face as white as her gown, gripped her children closer. Louis Charles, exhausted and terrified, began to cry, his small shoulders shaking. His father, the king, stood frozen, listening to the destruction of his guards. The gunfire lasted for hours. The Swiss, trapped and outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. They were pushed back from room to room, fighting with bayonets when their ammunition ran out. They died in the gilded salons, their blood staining the silk wallpaper. And some tried to surrender, but the mob, drunk on blood and fury, gave no quarter. They were beaten, stabbed, and thrown from windows. By the time the fighting ended, over 600 Swiss guards lay dead, along with hundreds of the attackers. Their bodies were mutilated, their red coats stripped and paraded on pikes through the streets.